How I faced the toxic friendship that almost destroyed my relationship and found my peace. I never imagined a relationship could be destroyed, not by a lack of love, but by the insistent presence of someone who refused to accept limits. At first it seemed simple, even banal, an old friendship of my girlfriend's that I believed was harmless. Raphael was the kind of person who would come in smiling, make jokes, and say he cared about her. But there was something hidden beneath the surface, a control disguised as care, a manipulation so subtle that for a long time neither Sabrina nor I could see it. Today, as I write this, I realize this story isn't just about jealousy or distrust. It's about how someone's toxic influence can corrode everything that's healthy, and how we need the courage to walk away from what makes us sick, even if it means breaking bonds that seemed unbreakable. My name is Gabriel, I'm 37 years old, and this story happened a little over 2 years ago. At the time, I was working in graphic design and was in one of the most stable periods of my life. I had achieved a balance that, until then, I thought was solid. When I met Sabrina, I felt like I was beginning a new chapter. She was sweet, intelligent, spontaneous, and seemed to understand me effortlessly. Our relationship flowed smoothly, with long conversations, easy laughter, and plans for the future. It was one of those beginnings that makes you believe that finally everything is okay. I had no idea that the real challenge was yet to come. Raphael entered my life naturally, as if he'd been a part of everything before I even arrived. Sabrina introduced me to him within the first few weeks. "He's like a brother to me," she said, and I, without reason to doubt it, welcomed him warmly. But soon the small annoyances began. Untimely messages, unsolicited advice, opinions about our relationship. Raphael always had something to say, always knew what was best for Sabrina. At first, I thought it was an exaggeration to find it strange. Today, I see that I was trying to be understanding with someone who never intended to respect my space. Over time, the boundaries began to blur. Raphael would show up unannounced, entering her home as if it were his own. He had access to her conversations, her social media, the details of our intimacy. When I talked about this with Sabrina, she begged me for patience, saying he was just protective, that he'd always been that way. I tried to understand, but something inside me began to fray. It was a constant feeling of invasion, of being tested, as if my love needed to be proven to a third party. And worst of all, I could see how much this confused her, as if she were torn between loyalty and affection. Conflicts began to emerge when I began setting boundaries. I asked her to talk to him about respect, about space, about us both. She tried, but his reaction was explosive. Raphael played the victim, cried, and said he was being left out. Sabrina, heartbroken, felt guilty. It was then that I realized the extent of the manipulation. He masterfully turned the tables, and I, no matter how hard I tried, ended up being the villain. It was the beginning of a painful process, an emotional drain that made me question not only the relationship, but also who I was within it. As the months passed, Raphael's presence stopped being merely annoying. It became oppressive. He commented on everything we did, criticized my actions, and insinuated that I wasn't good enough for her. There was always a subtle way he belittled me, as if he wanted to remove me from the picture without having to say it directly. And the most painful thing was seeing Sabrina believe some of what he said. Sometimes, a minor argument between us was enough for her to turn to him for advice. I saw the same pattern in his messages. He always portrayed himself as the hero, the friend who wants the best. Deep down, he just wanted control, and the closer he got, the further I drifted away from myself. I began to doubt my own perceptions. Raphael's manipulation was so well crafted that at times I thought maybe the problem was actually me. Sabrina said I was being possessive, that I was trying to distance her from someone important to her, and I, even though I sensed something was wrong, kept quiet to avoid further friction. This phase was one of the most difficult of my life, because I found myself trying to balance love, reason, and a constant feeling of helplessness. It was like being trapped in a triangle where one side always won, and it was never mine. I remember one specific weekend when everything exploded. Raphael showed up unannounced at Sabrina's house while I was there. He entered as usual without knocking. He started talking about her distancing herself from her friends, insinuating it was my fault. I tried to remain calm, but he provoked me, mocked me, and the atmosphere grew tense. Sabrina tried to intervene, and he, overcome with anger, pushed her during the argument. It was brief, but enough to make me lose my footing. At that moment, the penny dropped. This wasn't just emotional manipulation, it was abuse. And I knew that if I remained silent, I would be contributing to the same silence that kept her trapped. After that day, everything changed inside me. For the first time, I saw fear in Sabrina's eyes. She, who had always defended him, was shocked. He tried to justify himself, cried, and said he had lost control. But something broke in her, and in me too. It was then that I understood that love, no matter how pure, cannot survive in an environment dominated by fear. I spent days without sleep, feeling guilty for not having acted sooner, for having been complicit in the name of peace. But I also realized that that moment, however painful, would be the beginning of an inevitable change. Sabrina slowly began to pull away. Still confused, still trying to understand what had happened, but for the first time, she was seeing Raphael differently. He, on the other hand, intensified his attempts to control her. He called several times a day, emotionally blackmailed her, and spread lies about me among her friends. It was a silent, dirty war. I saw Sabrina trying to maintain her balance, but each day she became more fragmented. And I, even though I loved her, began to understand that perhaps my role at that moment was to help her break free, even if it meant losing what we had built. I reached a point where I no longer knew who I was within that relationship. Everything that had once been light became tense. I would wake up with a queasy stomach, waiting for the next conflict, the next invasion, the next manipulation. I began to distance myself from friends, decline invitations, and isolate myself. It was as if I were living around the moods of someone who wasn't even part of my relationship. The emotional burden was so great that I began to experience anxiety attacks. I slept poorly. I worked poorly, and my head kept spinning around the same question: how much longer could I endure this? Sabrina still tried to justify it, saying Raphael was going through a difficult time. But deep down, I knew this behavior had nothing to do with difficulties. It was pure control. There was a night when I really thought about giving up, not just on the relationship, but on everything. I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the man I saw there. I was exhausted, resentful, and filled with a rage I couldn't even contain. The worst part of living under manipulation is that it slowly eats away at you, taking away your confidence, your clarity, your self-esteem. And before I knew it, I was at my breaking point. I thought about leaving, disappearing, starting over somewhere else. But something inside me, perhaps the memory of who I was before it all, stopped me. I didn't want to be defeated. I wanted, for the first time, to face it head-on. That's when I sought help. I talked to Bianca, Sabrina's brother's wife. She always had a very clear-eyed outlook on everything. I told her what was happening, and she listened to me without judgment. She said something that stuck with me. You won't be able to help Sabrina if you keep getting sucked into the same cycle she was. That hit me hard. I was so focused on protecting her that I forgot to protect myself. That's when I decided to set real boundaries. I stepped away for a few days, letting Sabrina feel the weight of my absence, not out of pride, but so she could see how much that dynamic was destroying us. During this separation, I received several messages from her, confusing and painful. She said she missed me, but that she was also beginning to see things more clearly. She said Raphael had tried to convince her that I was the problem, that she was being manipulated by me. But this time she didn't believe him. She said she felt ashamed for not realizing earlier how much he dominated her emotionally. It was one of the first signs that something was changing. I cried reading it. For the first time in months, I felt that perhaps there was still hope, not just for our relationship, but for her as a woman, as a person beginning to break free from a cycle of abuse. The final turning point came when she decided to cut contact with him. It wasn't easy. Raphael freaked out, made a scene, tried to get close to her family, and spread lies on social media. But Sabrina stood firm, and I stood by her side, not as a savior, but as someone who finally understood the value of boundaries. Witnessing her journey was both painful and beautiful. I saw a woman being reborn, rediscovering her own voice, and I understood that my own breakthrough lay there too, in stopping fighting the uncontrollable and learning to protect my own peace. When Sabrina finally cut contact with Raphael, the silence that followed was almost deafening. It was strange at first. She was used to his constant presence, texts, calls, unsolicited advice, and I too was used to living on high alert, waiting for the next attack. Suddenly, everything went quiet, and it was in this silence that the wounds began to truly bleed. There were no more distractions, no more excuses, just the stark reality before us both. Sabrina cried a lot, alternating between guilt and relief. I, in turn, had to deal with something I'd been repressing for months. Anger. Anger for having allowed so much, for having doubted myself, for having silenced myself in the name of love. It was a slow process, full of emotional setbacks, but also full of small advances that, little by little, rebuilt what the manipulation had tried to destroy. We decided to seek therapy, both together and individually. I needed to understand why I'd submitted so much to that situation. I discovered that deep down, I was afraid of loss, afraid of being seen as just another controlling man. This fear paralyzed me. Sabrina, on the other hand, discovered how guilt shaped her decisions, how her friendship with Raphael was actually a prison disguised as loyalty. The therapy sessions helped us name our pain, see patterns, and rebuild trust. It was a long but liberating process. For the first time, we were looking at each other without external noise, without third parties defining what we should feel. Over time, love began to breathe again, without the constraints, without the constant tension. It was like learning to walk again, slowly, carefully, afraid of stumbling. But with the will to keep going, Sabrina began to rediscover herself. She went back to hanging out with healthy friends, rekindled old projects, and little by little, stopped apologizing for existing. I changed too. I began to prioritize myself more, to understand that healthy love doesn't mean sacrificing oneself for the other. I discovered that empathy and boundaries don't cancel each other out. They sustain each other. And the stronger I became, the more I could truly support her, without carrying the burden of salvation. Raphael, on the other hand, slowly disappeared. When he realized he no longer had power over her, he tried a few last-ditch maneuvers, dramatic messages, pleas for forgiveness, even attempts to play the victim to his family. But this time, it didn't work. Sabrina responded only once, saying she forgave him, but would no longer allow him to be around. She was firm, calm, and mature. I watched in silence, with a pride I couldn't contain, not because she chose me, but because she finally chose herself. And seeing it happen before my eyes was one of the most moving experiences of my life. Overcoming, for me, didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a clear victory with a happy ending and soundtrack. It was a sequence of small daily choices, not responding to provocations, not falling back into old habits, not losing myself again trying to prove something. It was realizing that sometimes winning is simply keeping the peace. Today, I look back and see how much I've grown, not only as a partner but as a man. I learned that loving someone isn't about protecting them from the world, but helping them protect themselves. And that, for me, was the purest form of love I've ever experienced. Today, when I look back, I see that the greatest battle wasn't against Raphael, nor against external circumstances. The greatest battle was internal, against fear, doubt, and the feeling of powerlessness. It was months of confronting feelings I'd avoided, of dealing with frustrations that silently consumed me. I learned that someone's manipulation doesn't define who you are, but it can show you how much you need to strengthen yourself. And in this process, I realized that true overcoming comes from within. It's not just about pushing a toxic person away, it's about allowing yourself to grow, protecting yourself, and reclaiming your own identity. Sabrina also changed profoundly. What was once blind loyalty transformed into self-confidence. She regained her voice, her opinion, and clear boundaries. I saw her struggle to free herself firsthand, and it inspired me more than any book or outside advice could. I learned that supporting someone isn't about imposing solutions, but being there as they find their own path. Sometimes, the strongest love is what allows freedom, even when freedom seems painful or risky. Today, we are both more aware of our limits and weaknesses. We talk openly, establish rules of coexistence, and respect each other's space. There are still moments of insecurity, remnants of the past, but they no longer dominate our lives. We've learned that vulnerability is not weakness, and that each challenge we've faced together has strengthened our relationship in a real, concrete way. The pain we've felt has fueled us to become more whole, more connected, more human. What I most want to share is that overcoming isn't magic. It's not a leap out of pain. It's an arduous process made up of small decisions, daily persistence, and the courage to face what corrodes us inside. It's learning to say no when we used to say yes out of fear of losing someone. It's rebuilding the self-esteem that's been shaken. It's understanding that limits aren't barriers, but bridges to healthy relationships. And above all, it's discovering that the peace we seek outside ourselves must first be built within ourselves. Today, I write here not just to vent, but to say that it is possible. It is possible to regain control of one's life. It is possible to love without losing oneself. It is possible to look at someone who caused us pain and still choose the path of serenity. Sabrina and I still bear the scars, but they don't define us. They have made us stronger, more attentive, more capable of protecting what is precious. And that is the essence of overcoming. Learning to be whole even after being broken.